Following the destruction of the temple and their exile into Babylon, the Jews of Judah sought ways in which they could remain distinct within the communities and nations they now lived. Adopting the ways of other nations is what they believed had led them into exile in the first place, and Jewish leaders and prophets continually called for the people to remain faithful to God wherever they lived. The prophets declared that if they followed the laws and lived in obedience to God, God would one day allow them to return to their land. Prophets like Ezekiel, Daniel, and parts of Isaiah promised over and over again that God had preserved this remnant and would restore them. There was one primary problem. They had no temple.
The temple was such a huge part of the Jewish identity and religious understanding that without it, they really weren't sure what to do, because the temple was believed to be the only place one could make sacrifices in order to receive forgiveness. And the temple was where they performed their annual National Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. And how does one do any of that without the temple? And in particular without the Ark of the Covenant, because that was where the presence of God that had gone with them wherever they went, even in the wilderness, and that was now gone too. So essentially, when the place that God has met you goes missing, how do you worship?
The Jews began by setting up 3 separate meeting places: a house for assembly, known today by its Greek name, synagogue, houses for prayer, and houses for study.
Well, it's during this time that we see the emergence of scribes and sages, who essentially take over daily communal life of the Jews, because the Levitical priests tended to temple matters, and the temple no longer exists. So you have rabbis or teachers that begin to rise up and teach and lead the people in matters of faith.
About 50 years into their exile, the world saw the emergence of Cyrus the Great and the Persian Empire, that set out to conquer not only its enemies, but the entire world. In 538 BC, he both allowed the Jews to return and ordered that their temple be rebuilt.
In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia, so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, and also in a written edict declared, "Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of those among you who are of his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and Judah and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let all survivors, in whatever place they reside, be assisted by the people of their place with silver and gold, with goods and with animals, besides free will offerings for the house of God in Jerusalem."
In order to explain what happens with Cyrus allowing the Jews to return to their homeland, you have to know what Cyrus's goals were. Cyrus had been listening to a very prominent prophet in Persia at the time named Zarathustra, and started a movement known as Zoroastrianism. Well, the Zoroastrians believed that the universe was dualistic, that it was made up of 2 distinct parts. One was good and light, and the other was evil and dark. And cosmic history was simply the epic battle between these 2 divine forces. At the end of time, a climactic battle would decide once and for all which of the 2 would dominate the universe. Well, human beings, of course, participated in this struggle. So Cyrus believed this battle was coming. Imagine that. Someone thought that the end of the world was nigh and that the Jews would play a part in that. So he set out to conquer the entire world in the name of the good side, and he believed that the God of the Jews, Yahweh, was aligned with the good side and that they needed to have their temple rebuilt. Allegedly based on a vision where the Israelite God came to him and told him to return the people to the land of Judah and rebuild their temple. So that's what he did.
The Jews who had gone into exile were primarily the elite leadership. Upon their return, many began to take foreign wives, which caused great distress for the high priest.
Separation from the Gentiles was necessary in the eyes of the returnees, in particular the high priest, Ezra. In their view, it was what had led to the north being destroyed and to the south being exiled in the first place. Mingling with Gentiles typically meant adopting some of their ways and culture, and they wanted to avoid that at all costs. And it wasn't that the Gentiles didn't fear God necessarily, it's just that they typically didn't worship only God. He was simply among their pantheon of gods. So Ezra ordered them to either divorce and send their wives away, or they would have all their possessions confiscated and would be banned from the temple community.
Over the next few hundred years, as the governments under which the Judeans lived changed from Persian to the Hellenistic Greeks under Alexander the Great, to the Ptolemaic Egyptians, and eventually the Seleucid Empire, their sectarianism grew as well. Initially, the Seleucid king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, made the Israelites an offer they could not refuse. Antiochus offered them actual citizenship if they adopted Greek ways.
Obviously, this offer created some pressure points in Judaism. First, it meant making a covenant with Greeks, and Jews don't tend to like to make covenants with anyone but God. Second, it would strip away their separateness that they had been clinging to so fiercely since the exile. And third, adopting Greek ways usually meant violating many of God's laws, such as requiring offerings of things like swine to pagan idols.
The final straw came when Antiochus forbade the worship practices of Judaism, had a statue of Zeus erected in the temple, and ordered the sacrifice of pigs to the Greek gods.
According to 1 Maccabees, a Levite priest named Mattathias the Maccabee was ordered to make the sacrifice of a pig, which in and of itself, of course, was a horrible affront to Jews, but then they were supposed to make this pig sacrifice to the Greek god Zeus in the temple, and Mattathias refused. Well, when another Hellenized Jewish priest stepped forward to do it in his place, Mattathias killed him and killed the government official who had ordered it, and then he fled with his 5 sons to the wilderness of Judea, where he kind of hung out for the rest of his life. And then his sons, Judas and Jonathan Maccabeus, would then lead a group of dissidents after their father's death back to Jerusalem, first attacking and killing all the Hellenized Jews, and then successfully revolting against the faltering Seleucid authorities.
For the first time in 400 years, Israel was an independent state once again. When Judas was killed in battle, they named his brother Jonathan as their king.
Well, the irony I always find here was that they were revolting against Hellenistic or Greek practices, and yet by naming Jonathan, who they had also installed as the high priest at the time, as king, they were engaging in the Greek practice of making the head of state also the religious leader, which Israel had always kept the 2 offices separate until Jonathan Maccabeus, which was a big reason why the Pharisees came into being. They were a separatist group because the word Pharisee means one who is separate. And that grew out of the sages and scribes who challenged the legitimacy of the Maccabees being named king, because they were not part of the Davidic royal line. They were Levites.
Pharisees applied purity laws that were intended for inside the temple to life outside the temple in an attempt to resist assimilation into the Greek culture that surrounded them. They were also very popular among the common people, as opposed to the more elitist Sadducees, who were members of the Levitical temple priesthood.
Well, the Sadducees were all priests, but not all priests were Sadducees. The Sadducees were kind of the equivalent of our upper 1%. They had a lot of power. They were politically connected to the monarchy because they were part of the Hasmonean dynasty of the Maccabees. So they ran a lot of the state's affairs, both domestically and internationally, and they equipped the military. And religiously, they tended almost solely to the temple matters, and they were not in and among the people like the Pharisees were. And the Sadducees also had major theological difference with the Pharisees, as they rejected all the laws, rites, practices, and interpretations that were not part of what they called the written Torah. Basically, if it was not in the first 5 books of Moses, then it was not scripture. And so the Sadducees, therefore, rejected the oral traditions of the Pharisees that would eventually become what we know as the Talmud, and the writings of the prophets they rejected, as well as the notion of the resurrection of the dead.
When civil war erupted between 2 Hasmonean brothers in 67 BC, and Rome was forced to intervene and put an end to Jewish independence, it was the Sadducees who embraced the Hellenistic ways of their occupiers and ingratiated themselves with Roman officials. It thus came as a surprise to the Sadducees when the Idumean, Herod, was named king of Judea by the Romans. Given Herod had been responsible for deposing the last monarch of the Hasmonean dynasty, Herod and the Sadducees were typically pitted against one another, despite Herod's attempts to ingratiate himself by renovating the temple.
Herod the Great was never really accepted by either the Pharisees or the Sadducees because he was not really a Jew in their eyes. His father was an Idumean or an Edomite who had been one of Israel's oldest enemies from the land of Edom and had been forcibly converted to Judaism by the Maccabean rulers. So, to make matters worse, his appointment by Caesar Augustus only reinforced the Jews' perception that he was nothing more than a Roman puppet, and not even a Jewish Roman puppet at that. But as crazy, cruel, and paranoid as Herod the Great was, he really did try to get his reluctant subjects to like him. And that's why he set about his temple renovation in around 20 BC. The project was so extensive and so grand that it would not be finished until 4 years before its destruction in 70 AD.
Herod's temple was topped with white alabaster and its doors gilded with gold, so that when the sun shone on it, the temple shone so brightly it was almost blinding. A literal light on a hill. Roman occupation never sat well with the Jews. And while there had been short-lived insurgencies over the years, a full-blown rebellion began in 66 AD. General Titus, who would later become emperor, eventually laid siege to Jerusalem in 70 AD and razed most of the city, including the temple, to the ground. Prominent Jewish leaders were either exiled, killed, or sold into slavery. Colonies of Romans and Greeks were established throughout Judea, and Romans even renamed the territory Syria Palestinia in order to quell any possible resurgence of Jewish independence in relation to their homeland. Nevertheless, that didn't stop other attempted revolts by exiled Jews in Egypt, Cyprus, Cyrene, and Libya over the next century, which ended finally and totally with Emperor Hadrian stomping out the last of Jewish resistance by engaging in mass executions and enslavement, destroying large numbers of Judean towns, and forbidding Jews from settling in Jerusalem, ensuring that no Jewish temple or state ever rose again.
Well, with the loss of the temple, there were some major shifts that began occurring. The Sadducees, who were tied to the temple, and the Zealots, those became irrelevant groups to the surviving Jewish communities. So what you were left with was the Pharisees and the Christians, who at this time were still considered a sect and part of Judaism. And one of the things that happens is when you get this revolt, this rebellion by Bar Kokhba in 135 AD against Emperor Hadrian, the Christians did not take part. So the Christians were treated very harshly by their fellow Jews because they had refused to fight, eventually leading to the Christians separating themselves from the Jewish community, and each would now evolve as 2 separate and very distinct groups.
The Pharisaic vision of Jewish law as a means by which ordinary people could engage with the sacred in their daily lives provided them with a position from which to respond to all these challenges in a way meaningful to the vast majority of Jews. So the practices of the Pharisees, which had involved implementing what had happened in the temple into everyday life, gave rise to what we now know as Rabbinic Judaism. The name change occurred because the term Pharisee, which means separate or sectarian, no longer applied because all the other sects of Judaism, the Sadducees and the Zealots primarily, had disappeared or were deemed irrelevant. So they embraced simply the term rabbi, which means teacher. The Pharisees had always argued that all Jews should act as priests. Now they argued that all Jews should act as rabbis. This isn't too different than the Christian concept of the priesthood of all believers.
As the focus of Jewish life shifted away from Jerusalem and rabbinic schools started arising and reuniting Jews, they began to codify what we know as the oral law, or the laws that existed outside of Scripture, but were needed to understand what the laws in Scripture actually meant. And so that would give rise to what we today call the Talmud. And they also canonized the Tanakh, which is their name for their scriptures.
During the Second Temple period, the primary text and translation of the Hebrew Scriptures was known as the Septuagint. It was a Greek translation that had been put together in Alexandria, Egypt, by 70 Jewish scholars during their exile. At the time, the Scriptures contained the Torah, the first 5 books of the Law of Moses, and the prophets, or Nevi'im. The other writings would not be canonized until between the 7th and 10th centuries by a group known as the Masoretes, and would produce the Masoretic texts, which are today still considered the most authoritative compilation and translation. The Hebrew Scriptures are referred to by Jews as the Tanakh. It is a word that combines the different sections of the Scriptures: the Torah, or instruction, the Ta, Nevi'im, or prophets, the Na, and the Ketuvim, or writings, Ka. So you get Tanakh. It's also not organized the same way the Christian Bible arranges their Old Testament writings.
Well, we have to understand that the Tanakh is not just history, it's not just theology, nor is it just a legal and ritual guide. It's something beyond all three. The best way to describe it is to recognize that it is the primary guide to the relationship between God and humanity, and the whole meaning and purpose of that relationship. It's a living document that unfolds over generations and millennia, and essentially the blueprint that God used to create the world.
For Rabbinic Jews, the Torah portion of the Tanakh is the embodiment of God's instruction and sacrificial laws. By studying the sacrifices and praying over them, Rabbinic Jews have determined that given their present situation of having no temple within which to offer sacrifices, study suffices as sacrificial practices.
In Rabbinic Judaism, Scripture alone is not enough to follow God's laws. The Pharisees followed what was called oral Torah, and that would later get put into written form by Rabbinic Jews, and it would become known as the Talmud. Well, the Talmud addressed all the issues that the Torah alone did not. For instance, God says not to work on the Sabbath day. Okay, great, but what constitutes work? This oral Torah helped give parameters around the laws in Scripture.
The Talmud consists of several different elements. The first is Mishnah. The Mishnah is a compilation of legal opinions and debates. Statements in the Mishnah are typically terse, recording brief opinions of the rabbis debating a subject, or recording only an unattributed ruling, apparently representing a consensus view. The second is Gemara, which means completion. The Gemara mainly focuses on elaborating on the opinions of the Mishnah. Most statements within the Talmud are considered either halakha or Haggadah. Halakha dealt with legal statements and issues, whereas Haggadah dealt with more theological, historical, or moral matters.
Haggadah is sort of the story behind the story. It expands upon a lot of the stories we find in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Tanakh. It expands upon the creation story. It expands upon the story of the fall of Lucifer. It gives additional stories behind the fall of humanity. It establishes things like the order of the Passover Seder meal. Exodus tells you the Passover meal happened. The Haggadah goes into the details of what actually occurred at the meal, all the steps and all the parts.
It is the use of both these texts that helps shape not just life as a rabbinic Jew, but the festivals and holy days they observe as well, to be discussed in the next session.